Peace and Conflict Studies at Oslo New University College. He's a very known scholar on the Horn of Africa in general, particularly Ethiopia and Eritrea. Professor Tronvoll has written, published, researched on issues related to human rights, elections, peace and conflict studies, democracy, and published two prominent books. The first one, which many of you might remember, Brothers at War. And the second one is War and the Politics of Identity, with particular reference to Ethiopia. Professor Tronvoll has also been reflecting very recently on the war in Ethiopia, particularly on the in the northern part of Ethiopia, in the case in Tigray, but he's also very much conversant about the situation in Oromo. So he will be speaking on what went wrong in Ethiopia and can it be fixed.
Akamirtu to all friends of Oromo. And yes, the title I was asked to speak on, it's more the broader Ethiopian context, and I named it What's Wrong with Ethiopia and Can It Be Fixed? It is posed obviously as a rhetorical question. What's wrong with Ethiopia in the sense that we all abhor its perpetual conflict dynamics? Why is Ethiopia caught in what appears to be an endless cycle of conflicts? And how come no regime seemed to manage to fix it, to stop the endless bloodsheds occurring in sites across the country? I will here briefly touch upon three key conflict dynamics and four factors contributing to sustaining conflicts. And in conclusion, I will address some possible approaches to elevate the situation. First, however, let me stress that the contemporaneous conflict dynamics in Ethiopia, as touched upon by Alex too, must be analyzed and understood in a long durée perspective. Most of the conflicts ravaging the country today have their origin maybe 50 years, 70 years, or maybe even 120 years ago. And their convoluted character disallow ready-made best practice conflict resolution approaches generally facilitated by international actors. So my starting position here, as a Ferengi myself, is not to present any conclusions or recommendations, only some modest reflections based upon Ethiopian particularities and comparative research. So the three key conflict dimensions we see in Ethiopia today. There is not a civil war in Ethiopia, but multiple conflicts rooted in, influenced, and driven by a variety of different actors. The key violent conflict we see unfolding today, however, can, for sake of simplification, be understood along three dimensions. And excuse me for not elaborating or including other conflict dimensions, as time restrictions do not allow me to do so. The first one, center-periphery conflicts, where politically positioned actors are fighting to secure or increase regional autonomy and a devolved system of governance, in opposition to a perceived or real centralizing federal government. These conflicts are reflecting the waxing and waning strength of regional versus central authorities today, as well as in history. The Tigray and Oromo resistance, contemporary and historically, towards a centralizing state are cases in point to illustrate this conflict dimension. The second one, intercommunal or horizontal conflicts between groups defined along ethnic or clan lines and fought mainly over grounded resources, more specifically the control of territory. This is what we see unfolding today between Amhara and Tigray actors, for instance, over West Tigray, as well as between Amhara and Oromo over territories along their common border, Somalia, Afar, Gedio, Guji, and I can continue to mention a host of other cases across the country. The third conflict dimension, however, is much more nuanced and challenging to unpack, as it relates to citizens and collectives' understanding of and relation to the state itself. For purposes of this presentation, we can label it as a contested state narrative, or if you are inclined, the nations versus empire dimension. These are conflicts where political actors either aim to take over control of the state, to mold it in accordance to their political visions, as TPLF-EPRDF did after the 1991 takeover, or Ethiopian nationalist actors today has a vision of capturing the state. Or conversely, conflicts driven by movements who aim to secede their nation from the empire, as Eritrea managed in 1991. Some would characterize the Oromo struggle to fall within this category of conflicts, as fraction of the Oromo movement has arguably called for the establishment of a separate Oromo state. Conversely, elements within the ongoing Amhara or Ethiopianist armed movement have called for the takeover of the state to impose a new government structure reflecting their nationalist ambitions. Time disallows me to elaborate further on these dimensions, but I will return to them in my conclusion on how to possibly approach them for resolution. But prior to possible solutions, it is important to comprehend why conflicts and mass violence are sustained in Ethiopia today, despite citizens' interests and hope for peace and security. There have been numerous attempts throughout the last 50, 60 years or so to solve some of these intrinsic conflict dimensions in Ethiopia, including 2 revolutions and several regime changes. The last one only 5 years ago, as we all remember vividly. Alas, all of them in vain. Conflicts are still rampant. Numerous attempts of peace and reconciliation processes have been carried out, and formal peace and cessation hostilities agreements have been signed. Nevertheless, relapse to conflict is the norm in Ethiopia and not the exception. Why is it so? To start with, root causes of conflicts are different than triggering factors creating the outbreak of violence. Furthermore, factors sustaining conflicts and preventing peacemaking are often something very different than what caused the conflict in the first place. The comparative literature on state building, political transition, and war may help us to understand the cycle of violence and the constraints to peacemaking in Ethiopia. This is framed in an understanding that Ethiopia has been in a continuous political transition since the 1960s student movement started to challenge the imperial order and the master narrative of Ethiopian exceptionalism and Ethiopianism. A transition that continued during the Derg military junta and even after the EPRDF takeover in 1991. And the transition is still ongoing under Abiy Ahmed and Prosperity Party. Let us understand then why the relapse to conflict during such a transition. First, countries with a deep history of violence, conflict, civil wars are more prone to reverting to violence as a mean to impose a hegemonic position or to solve political discords if institutionalized politics, as for instance elections, fail to produce the result wanted. Hardly any country in the world is as conflict prone as Ethiopia, which have experienced large-scale civil wars in more or less every generation for the past 200 years, and continuously encounter multiple small-scale conflicts spread across its vast territory. There are many factors contributing to the continuous cycles of violence in the country, from a manifestation of past dependency, reflection of political culture, inclination of warrior traditions, exhibition of masculinity, remnants of a warring feudal tradition. All factors have been mentioned in scholarly research. Politics in Ethiopia exhibits all these characteristics, which are determinantal to undermine a transition to stability, increased democratization, and nationwide civilized and non-violent politics. This leads us to the second factor, the institutional capacity and capability of the state and the composition of society itself. Paul Collier, he can be criticized on many issues, but he has also described that states inhabited by the world's bottom billion as structurally dangerous. These states lack institutionalized and agreed upon procedures to manage political discord, They lack institutions of checks and balances to restrict executive power and protect minority concern. They lack equitable distribution of public wealth and resources. And finally, they lack an independent judiciary which can subject officials to the law. These are all essential attributes to ensure and secure government accountability and legitimacy to discourage political protest and armed rebellion. Politics in such states tends thus to be a zero-sum game and cast in the language of an existential struggle in which contestants are willing to use all means, including mass violence, to obtain or sustain power. Adding to the dangers of the inherent structural weakness of the Ethiopian state is also the heightened insecurity created by the political transition itself. Ethiopia is in all practical terms an autocracy, although a democratic multi-party constitution was ratified in 1995. Since then, it has been argued that Ethiopia has been transitioning to democracy, although every multi-party election since 1995 have been deeply rigged and manipulated. As revolutions and processes of democratization involve dismantling all the institutions of control and coercion to be replaced by new organs with initial very little authority. This facilitates opportunities of contestation and conflict. Comparative research indicates that particularly susceptible for conflict are countries transitioning from repressive authoritarian and military rule, as Ethiopia is. The final characteristics about Ethiopia relevant to understand to the challenges of peacemaking is its extreme identity-based and driven politics. Although with some ambiguity, research findings points to that ethnic divisions in general influence conflicts. Moreover, the federal system in Ethiopia, which put emphasis on group rights and ethnicity, is attributed by many scholars to enhance conflict dynamics in the country. When political visions and positions are articulated and aligned with the ethnic group in contestation with other groups with conflicting interests and demands, it follows that if no political middle ground is found, a possible mobilization of support will be based on ethnicity. In such context, political discourse is often framed as an existential threat to the group's survival, thus exacerbating existing tensions that may likely lead to violent outcomes. All of the above characteristics of Ethiopian politics and society are framing the ongoing political transition and influence agency of individual and collective actors across the country, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. To overcome these deeply entrenched and intrinsic attributes of society, the state, its governance system, and its political culture is an overwhelming task which may take generations to achieve. So, let me start to sum up. What can be done, if anything at all, to fix Ethiopia's problems with ending perpetual conflict dynamics? And let me stress, as a Ferengi, that responsibilities for these rest, of course, fully with Ethiopian people, and that outsiders should be very careful to impose any solution to these very intricate challenges. Moreover, the international diplomatic community and the development industry should pause and reflect upon the imperative of do no harm in designing possible intervention programming. We often see that in our sincere, or maybe not so sincere, interest to help, the do no harm principle is forgotten, and interventions actually prolong conflicts instead of reconciling them. And I think that's a valid point in the current international engagement with Ethiopia to keep in mind. With this caveat, let me briefly outline some possible approaches relating to the three conflict dynamics mentioned in my introduction. Conflicts over the power balance between regional autonomy and central authority have haunted Ethiopia for decades. The new constitution of 1995 was intended once and for all to solve this. But we all know that the constitutional framework has intrinsic problems in its own right, and today we can even consider it to be part of the problem. However, perhaps the biggest problem related to the constitution is the fact that it has never been fully implemented and respected by the incumbent, as both the TPLF-EPRDF government and the prosperity government of Abiy Ahmed hold authoritarian inclinations. In particular, the prerogatives of regional political autonomy were never respected by the EPRDF government nor the incumbent Prosperity Party, which both eclipsed regional self-determination rights by imposing a centralizing, omnipresent party structure, relegating constitutional rights redundant. So, if the incumbent actually respect the constitutional framework of the land and the liberal values and democratic and human rights therein enshrined, this may prove to pacify much of the conflict dynamics originating at the regional level. Increasing the democratic inclination of political elites in Ethiopia, if at all possible, is possibly the most effective conflict prevention remedy we can find. Secondly, implementing the current constitutional framework in full may, however, also turn into a major conflict driver in its own right, as the territorial demarcation of regional states, of zones and woredas are themselves often contested. We have seen how territorial claims to West Tigray and Raya have led to mass atrocities, and contestation over defining ethnic hegemony in heterogeneous communities continue to produce massacres of civilians of all ethnicities. However, conflicts over border demarcation and territories have existed since the origin of civilization. A vast comparative knowledge and experiences are to be found, which may contribute to identifying lasting solutions to territorial disputes in Ethiopia. It may take time, resources, commitment, and not least willingness to compromise, but material conflicts are solvable. Finally, both the two conflict dynamics mentioned, regional autonomy versus central authority and contestation over territory, are inherent to the grand conflict over what Ethiopia is, comprises, and embodies. The Ethiopian polity is by many considered to be an empire, as also mentioned by Alex, and others believe, however, that it is a sacrosanct entity with the integrity bestowed by God. However, the crafting of Ethiopia as seen on the map today, where the ruling elite derived from a highland core mobilized its peasant armies to conquer and subjugate neighboring peoples, kingdoms, and nations in a colonial race against Western imperialists at the turn of the 20th century, provides historical justification for classifying Ethiopia as an empire, at least in an analytical sense of the term. Since the days of the student movement, the Ethiopian empire, or polity if you may, has been challenged from within, from political actors at the center as well as from the periphery. The empire crumbled and lost a key component in 1991 with the departing of Eritrea. Ogadennian political elites have tried both by violence in the 1970s and through constitutional mechanisms in the 1990s to wrestle Somalia regional state away from the grip of the empire, but was both time denied by the center. After experiencing a genocidal war on Tigray from 2020 to 2022, it is plausible to argue that the Tigrayans today would vote overwhelmingly in favor of secession and independence had they been given that opportunity, which they were promised by the political leader and which is enshrined in the constitution. And finally, the Oromo insurgency and the struggle for self-determination and possible independence from the imperial state is the longest running in Ethiopia, traversing 4 different regimes and still ongoing today.
Will you conclude, Professor?
Yeah, I'm finalizing now. Finding a compromise which may reconcile the preservation of Ethiopian polity under its current authoritarian outlook in a phase of deep-rooted cultural and historical claims and visions projected by political elites, claiming to represent their people and nation states to be, seems unattainable now. This mother of all conflicts in Ethiopia has never been solved, only suppressed over and over again by a strong center. Hence, when the center becomes weak, these multiple conflicts dynamics reappear with vengeance, and they will likely do so in the future. So we ought to keep in mind that states are not God-given enduring entities, which the current map of Ethiopia of Horn of Africa aptly illustrates with the presence of 2 of the world's newest states and another de facto one. How many new states will be born out of the crumbling Ethiopian empire? Well, if any, that remains to be seen.